I guess what I'm saying is that that experience of teaching and knowing what's important, that's where the open education resource can play a part. I think it's
Mm.
helping students navigate that, like at the beginning, what's important? Like, is it all important? Is some of it more important than others? And students can get lost in detail and lose that bigger picture.
Welcome to Speaking of Open, the podcast where we explore the vibrant world of open education in Australasia. I'm Ash Barber, Academic Librarian and Senior Coordinator of the OER Collective at the Council of Australasian University Librarians.
And I'm Mais Fatayo, Learning Experience Design Manager at University of Technology, Sydney. We are friends and open education advocates, here to share stories, spark ideas, and celebrate the amazing work happening across our region.
In each episode, we chat with educators, librarians, and learning designers, transforming teaching and learning through open educational practices.
In today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Julian Pakay, a biochemistry academic at La Trobe University, to explore how a small open education resource project sparked a much larger transformation in science education. Now, after reading Julian's case study, highlighting metacognition, authentic learning, and cross-disciplinary collaboration, I was amazed by how he and his team used open educational practices to drive meaningful improvement in teaching and learning, particularly in improving student engagement, accessibility, and academic impact.
Speaking of open, should we dive in?
Let's do that. Welcome, Julian, to Speaking of Open. It's wonderful having you with us today. I would like to start with learning more about your role and what brings you to this work in particular.
Yeah, thanks very much for inviting me on, Ash and Maz. Yeah, look, I'm a teaching-focused academic at La Trobe University. I'm in the biochemistry and chemistry department. I'm a biochemist, probably consider myself much more of a biologist. I've been working here in essentially a teaching-focused role for about 15 years. And prior to that, I was a researcher. I didn't do any teaching at all. I initially started, my role was looking after third year biochemistry. So I looked after all the subjects that are part of the biochemistry major. I still do this, and it's still like a really passionate part of my job. Things have expanded a little bit more. I teach sort of at all different year levels now as well. So I've been doing it for quite a while, and I've sort of seen a pattern of, I guess, issues with the students, maybe not attaining some of the learning goals that we would like. And I've come into the open education space as a way of developing interventions to try to help the students. I have to admit, I came into it sort of very naively, and I've sort of changed a lot of my views and how we do things since then. But I'm sure we're going to get into a little bit of that.
Yeah, we really would love to hear more about how open education changed your views to learning and teaching. So, over the 15 years of experience you have, what is your favorite part of the work and the things that makes you passionate about it?
Yeah, I mean, look, probably one of the most rewarding aspects of the job is to see my students develop. And, in particular, I get a lot of pride out of seeing them succeed. So when I was teaching primarily third year, I would see them graduate and, stay in contact with people who were going into sort of postgraduate degrees, or maybe they were, going into the workplace. Having that kind of contact with them, and I always felt that if I had some kind of positive influence, even if it was a small amount, then that justified my job. Now that I teach at sort of first year and second year levels as well as masters and honours, I get to see them all the way through their studies, and that's been really rewarding to sort of see students develop from first year, get to know them, and then finally sort of see them graduate and go. So that's really great. The other aspect of the job for me that I really enjoy is working with other people. So there's a sort of really nice collegiate aspect, and I enjoy working with other academics. I always feel I'm kind of lucky to work with all these people who are much cleverer than me, but also feel that way about my students as well. I sort of take a bit of a collaborative approach to their learning as well. And they're always surprised when I say that. You guys are smarter than me. I've just been in the job longer. It's why I might know a few more things, but I fully expect them to surpass me, and a lot of them do.
Mm, lovely to hear that. I think it's a social aspect to the teaching that brings that energy, and also I think seeing students grow and seeing your influence on students in their workplace is very satisfying for that type of role.
Yeah, no, it's interesting as well, because when I started this role, it's enough that I know a lot about biochemistry. The pastoral care aspect is quite significant, but also realizing that teaching involves creating a relationship with your students. That's really important, getting to know them, getting to understand them. That allows you to be a much more effective teacher.
Mm,
And it's not just sort of having them as friends, it's about understanding people.
Absolutely. To me, I feel this is what makes teaching more authentic, that students actually see meaningful experience and the teacher also see that impact on the students' progress. Julian, I would like to hear a little bit more about your case study in Oya Down Under.
Well, I mean, I'll take you through from sort of the very beginning, and the very beginning is when I first started teaching. I became very interested in sort of students' approach to maths, and we kind of call it quantitative literacy because it sort of encompasses their attitude towards numbers and looking at that kind of hard data as well. And I found that that was something that they really struggled with. I wanted to improve those skills, and I was teaching practical classes where it was really important for them to have a sort of a good understanding of this. And I sort of know how important it is if they graduate. We think if they go and work in a laboratory, that's the first thing that they'll need to be able to do is to do sort of these simple calculations and things, or things that we take for granted that are simple. But I found that there was a lot of, well, they weren't performing well in it. There was also a lot of anxiety around it. I tried to understand this, so I'd create diagnostic tests for them to try to work out exactly where they were going wrong. Probably in some ways, that contributed to their anxiety, but it was important for me to get a handle on what was going on. And we collected data for a number of years, or I collected data for a number of years, and then eventually felt that I had enough that I could kind of design some interventions for this. And I got what I wanted really, which was a first year subject. So I was teaching third year. So I got a first year subject which really dealt with quantitative literacy for biology students, and it was targeted for our biomedical science cohort. And that's where the Open Education project started. I wanted a resource for them. So I just started doing this, like creating one naively. But that led to a collaboration with the Trobe Bureau, and eventually we could publish our book, which was initially the idea was a supporting textbook for those students as part of that intervention.
That's wonderful. Diagnostic tests is usually one of the solutions that I've seen in several areas, like in nursing, science, teaching, mathematics. And I see how they are very useful for foundational knowledge. I like how you described that your work is backed up by data that you collected over the year to introduce intervention. But it's really interesting here because I've seen many diagnostic tests in several disciplines embedded into curriculum. But the idea of introducing open education resource is actually something that not I have seen many times. So, and I'm sure there is a lot to hear about from your experience with this intervention. So, in the case study where you talked about how your OER work aimed to help students overcome those common challenges, as you mentioned, like threshold concepts, for example, you've also highlighted some barriers. You talked about the large textbooks, 900-page textbook, lecture-heavy teaching, this joint course structure, which is something also common, and the inherently abstract nature of biochemistry. Having a science background, I can appreciate the challenges there. So how do you find the OER to be a solution for these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. And like I said, when I started this, I was probably a little bit naive when I came into it. I thought, well, if I just provide some background information to the students and I have some practice problems for them to do, like that'll be a really good resource. And I mean, the reality is there is a lot of this stuff already available. And so one of the things to sort of think about was like, well, how can we have a point of difference? Now, we'd collected a lot of data, and there was one sort of thing that was persistently coming up, and that was that the students were really anxious about maths in general. Otherwise, good students would see a problem and almost freeze and not do it. And we developed a few things, so tutorials and workshops for students to help them. And we wanted to look at what was happening before and after. One of the things that we noticed that when they got a little bit more help, maybe they didn't get the right answer to a problem, but they were more likely to attempt it. And so we're seeing that data and we're saying, well, there was something about confidence that was important. I took that as a win if they would at least attempt a problem rather than just completely abandon it and disengage because they're anxious. But the anxiety aspect was something that I wanted the OER to sort of deal with. So one of the things that we've done is incorporated a section where I talk about how to approach this problem, but also just addressing anxiety head on. Now, the thing is, when we start learning maths, when we go into prep or grade one, no one's got anxiety about maths then. So it's something that develops along the way. And if I go and talk to primary school teachers, it seems that anxiety occurs really early. So in some ways, like the earlier the intervention could be, the better. And I met with a lot of people about this and spoke about it. But it was understanding a little bit that my students were coming in as adults with a lot of baggage. They've had anxiety for a long time around these things and they've tried to avoid it. A lot of them have chosen maybe a biological sciences degree in the hope to kind of avoid mathematics. That's not easy to, it's not easy to avoid. If anything, just because as the fields developed, biology's become a lot more of a predictive discipline. So much more akin to, say, physics or chemistry, and they're playing a bigger role in it. So the students kind of have to come to grips with understanding data and working with numbers. But, like we could bring in the experience here, I suppose. And I know that if you're working in the field, eventually you'll get good at the kinds of calculations that you'll need. And the sooner that can happen, the better for someone. But we knew that you can overcome these. And, we could point to myself, right? Like I struggled with all of this stuff when I was a student, but now I can do it. And I can write a textbook about maths. So I think there was, to talk directly and very explicitly students about, well, this is a common problem. If you find it hard, it's because it is. If you've got anxiety around it, well, that's pretty common as well. And here are some steps that you can take to get around it. So the open platform is very good for embedding a teacher presence into it. So it was a good platform for that. Now, the other thing that we did is, like, when we developed our subject, it was really maths through this prism of biology or biomedical science. So it was a way of kind of engaging with them with something which is relevant. And we were lucky that we could do this. As biologists, we could develop a subject like that. And maybe it was a lot less abstract than if it would have been developed purely by mathematicians. So we could kind of embed the importance of maths for the discipline, but also this idea of it's going to be part of your career identity. So that was something else that we could do as well. We embedded interviews with people who used maths in jobs that our students would go into. So some of these might have been postgraduate students or people working in various clinical things, in academia and industry. And we could get them to actually just talk about their experience in learning maths and their advice for approaching it if you do have anxiety, but also getting them to work through like maybe a common problem that they've got. And we think this is quite a powerful way to kind of reach the students and at least get them to take it seriously. And well, one, realize that it's not something that you can avoid, but two, that it's, if you've got anxiety around it, well, that's normal. Okay. You've got maybe a medical doctor saying, I had the same problems, but this is how I've kind of overcome it. And so different practical advice, for the students. So it's something that the open education platform could do, an open education resource could do, that maybe a traditional textbook couldn't do as effectively.
That's that flexibility and openness brings a lot to the teaching, especially in math. And I can really appreciate the challenges in foundational math, as you said, Julian, for even at early school years. And all the anxiety that comes with that. I always tell my children that no matter where you go in life, math is important and you really need to understand the foundation. So it's really great to see that there is an OER for that can be adapted and used in different areas at different stages, whether in an academic format or in the workplace.
And it sounds like you're saying that it's that contextualization as well that's a really key aspect. You can put in those case studies, those interviews with people that the students could relate to in some way. They could see themselves as a future, that profession. So someone talking to them who they aspire to be, who's having the same struggles as them, that's something you could put into this text.
And Ash, I have to admit, a lot of that was a product of the collaboration I had with the E-Bureau at La Trobe, in particular Stephen Chang. Well, we sat down and we spoke a lot about these sorts of things, and he could bring that wider experience of working on multiple projects, into it. So you tend to become very siloed in your discipline and think of everything in terms of what you're immediately working on. But the problems are common, right? These sorts of issues are common across lots of different disciplines. And there's an incredible power in working with someone who's got sort of a bird's eye view of the entire topography of education like that, because I'm working on so many different open education projects and could bring these ideas from other disciplines into it. So certainly that was a realization that I wasn't necessarily going to find the answers within my own discipline. I had to sort of look a little bit outside of it, and that worked really well.
Yeah, that in itself, in sort of a meta perspective, is a really inherent part of open education in general, that there's a lot of cross-disciplinary collaboration. I mean, Mace is a learning designer, I'm a librarian. We met because of open ed, and now we're so deeply enmeshed in like everything we do. And I learned so much from Mace as a result of that, and Mace learns from me too, I believe. And so it's something that's a real strength of open ed, is that we get to have these wonderful collaborations just because that is part of the field.
Yeah, and I've become a very strong advocate for this third space collaboration. So I think it might be something that I feel is a little bit underutilized by higher education, by universities. They don't often quite know what to do with the professional staff that do have that sort of an incredible oversight in lots of different things. And I think one way to effectively use them is just to put them in the same room as the academics and just talk to each other. That's just really important. What I do now is I discuss everything I'm doing with my collaborators, and they have amazing ideas, right? So often
Mm,
they'll come up with something that I've never thought of, or they'll put
mm.
me in contact with someone who's working on something similar. So I think just there's some real power in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll be looking forward to speaking with Stephen in our next episode to learn more about the third space and how that collaboration is working for him too.
Yeah.
So you mentioned teacher presence before, and your case study also talks about the importance of teacher presence and enabling a strong teacher presence in the online classroom. In this fast evolving world of artificial intelligence, creating shortcuts to content and answers and
Mm.
seemingly having the solution to everything, do you see this, teacher presence as one of the areas where open education really shines? How does AI and open ed work together for you?
Yeah, look, that's also a really good question. There's a couple of aspects to AI and open education that are important. I mean, one of those is like when I started this project, in particular, the second open education resource, we had the threshold concepts in biochemistry. It became apparent to me that I could just sit down with one of the large language models like ChatGPT and just say, please write me a 20,000 word chapter on this aspect of biochemistry. Write me 100 multiple choice questions, and it could do it really efficiently. It would do that very fast. And it's like, well, is there any point in me writing this open education resource? And that really became a big point of discussion between Stephen and I. It's like, well, okay, given that it can do that, well, what can we do that's different? That's a point of difference. Like, is there something that open education can do that AI can't? And it turns out it can do a lot. And one of those things is the experience that you bring and that teacher presence. And I think that's the really important thing. And there's also this realization, I suppose, that the cost of information is decreased substantially. Like it was already cheap. Already we could find a lot of information online. Now we've got a very, very efficient way of retrieving this kind of information through AI. So, well, therefore, my value is going to be in contextualizing that information for students and maybe helping them navigate that huge amount of information. It's, you can learn biochemistry through YouTube videos if you want, but which one do you watch out of the several hundred that you might have on any given topic? So it's about helping students navigate like what the important concepts are and leading them through this map, I suppose, to get to the right place. AI is efficient, and I notice that students will use it. So even if I've got the textbook that we pay for them to have, like we have a commercial textbook we use for our first year biology students, on top of that, they've got my open education resource. But if I go into the practical classes and I ask them a question, the first reflex is to go and get the answer through Google, and you'll have now Google AI's algorithm that will come up with a very, very efficient, precise answer. The problem is you don't learn anything. It just tells you the answer without any context. So I think the challenge is how do we provide that context and actually create that sort of deep learning that's really important. So I think there's still scope for open education resources to do it and still scope for teachers to do it. It's a real challenge going forward. And I mean, people are talking about AI and academia, and I guess a lot of the conversation is about academic integrity in terms of like the aspect of validity of assessment. So they worry about students cheating using AI to help cheat. I think a bigger problem is much of the learning previously was serendipitous. The fact we didn't have efficient ways of obtaining information. We had to, read a chapter of a textbook and go, oh, well, that doesn't really answer it. And find something else and maybe go and find a paper or whatever it was. And you did a lot to get that information. It was inefficient. But there was a huge amount of learning going on in that circuitous kind of route that you took to get there. When you just get the answer given to you completely out of context, I think there's not the same level of deep learning that went on that previously did. So I think open education has an opportunity there, I think, to play a part, bring in the teacher presence, bring that context in and promote a sort of a deeper learning.
And
So
that deeper learning, I suppose, supports what you were saying earlier with those. You said that otherwise good students would see a math problem and just freeze. And that was about confidence. And I think confidence comes from having that deeper learning. You're kind of immersed in the world of that topic. You've got a lot of background information that you're getting serendipitously as you're trying to find the specific answer. And so those, otherwise good students perhaps wouldn't be freezing in those moments because they're not just looking for that answer. They're experiencing the whole world of that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, I mean, if you want to use the AI tools well, like you need to have that foundational knowledge. And so there's a saying by Carl Sagan, the physicist, if you want to make an apple pie from scratch, you've got to reinvent the universe, right? So it's like if I give you a complex problem in biochemistry, like you could solve it using all these AI tools, but if you don't have that foundational knowledge, it's going to take you a long time to do it. And you might get lost along the way. So building that foundation is important. So our resource threshold concepts in biochemistry, that was really about trying to think like what's really important in the discipline. What do you need? Like what's the key foundational knowledge? And I was lucky that there'd been a lot of work, a lot of research done on that. And people have identified those. And we thought, okay, there's no point in us writing another 6 kilogram, 900-page textbook on biochemistry. Let's focus on like the really key things that would allow them to maybe then go and read that textbook or go to another resource, but give them that important foundational knowledge. And we sort of settled on looking at what we call key threshold concepts. Now, biochemistry wasn't the first discipline to do this. Others have sort of mapped those key threshold concepts that they need for the discipline. But it has been done in biochemistry. And we took that research quite seriously. And we decided to make a resource which focused on getting those concepts across. And I love the name threshold concepts because they really it's like walking through a door, opening a door, right? Once you know them. And, like we can think about threshold concepts, like a good one would be like, say if you, like a lot of people read history, right? Like an important threshold concept in the discipline of history is understanding that sources might be biased, right? Once you understand that, you look at history completely differently. Like if you read a narrative account, you go, well, is that person telling the truth? Were they an eyewitness to this? Do they write it 200 years after the fact? You start to question it and you look at all your historical sources very, very differently. So understanding that there might be bias, right, is a key threshold concept. Now, in biochemistry, something that would be a key threshold concept is how information flows in biological systems. And I was finding I was teaching this at every year level again to the same students, right? They just weren't getting it, right? But once you understand that, then you can understand things like evolution. Then you completely look at biochemistry differently. So it's transformative in how you approach it. And it's important not just to sort of understand it, but you've got to integrate that knowledge within yourself. Like it's got to become part of you. The science fiction writer Robert Heinlein, he came up with this word grok, Grok. And you'll hear it in sort of computer science and engineering circles. And it's become to mean to understand, but like more than just understand. It's like you internalized it. It's part of you. And I think we should use this verb in a lot of other disciplines as well. Like, you've got to grok something to a point where it's really part of you and it's how you see the world. And so we wanted those concepts to be really internalized by our students, and then they can sort of actually really get into the discipline and understand it. But without those, we find that they struggle a lot.
I love the term. I'm absolutely adopting grok. That's so good.
Yeah. So anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that experience of teaching and knowing what's important, that's where the open education resource can play a part. I think it's helping students navigate that, like at the beginning, what's important? Like, is it all important? Is some of it more important than others? And students can get lost in detail and lose that bigger picture.
And the interrelation of the different components as well. I think that's something you talk about in your case study, is how the original textbooks in this area, they are very compartmentalized, this topic, then this topic, then this topic. And it's not until the end that the students can really see how it all connects and intersects. And that's something that your OER helps them to do, helps to kind of weave through the thread the whole way, helps them see how everything is like part of this ecosystem and not just disparate pieces.
Yeah, no, it's true. And I mean, what was interesting in really thinking about what's fundamental for understanding, what are the key threshold concepts and how to get those across, that had a big influence on my teaching as well. So after writing the open education resource, like I've used that to develop a series of lectures, which really just focus on that. And we find students are coming into first year university and they're learning biology. It's initially very overwhelming and it appears, completely abstract. That's the real challenge. And it doesn't matter what you start with, you kind of have to draw black boxes around other parts of things and go, look, just wait. We'll get to it and it'll all kind of make sense at the end. But, like it's a massive leap of faith that you're asking the students to make that, if I persevere, it's all gonna work out. But we're very explicit in telling them that now. Like it's normal for it to feel a little bit disjointed and abstract. But we also realize that there's a big power in giving that initial overview and sort of trying to make that connection in the broadest possible terms at the beginning and then going through and filling out the detail. Because at least they know that it's going to connect. Yeah, I hated second year biochemistry when I was a student, right? Yet I became a biochemist. But I really didn't like it. And, if I think back, it was that abstract nature. I just didn't know why I was learning particular things.
Mm. So one of the common challenges of OER is how to make them sustainable. So how to maintain them post-publication. So you've created these wonderful OER. What do you do now? It's great that they can be updated easily, but also it means they need to be updated.
That's
So,
right. Yeah.
and you do address this in your case study a little bit, calling your approach a virtuous loop. So I suppose what does that look like in practice?
Yeah. So, I guess this is the other thing that we really thought about the design. If you're thinking about like, well, why can't we just get AI to write this book for us? I even think, okay, well, what are we trying to achieve? So we took a sort of a backwards design approach. We said, well, this is what we want for our students. This is what we want for our graduates. These are the goals that we want to attain, and then work towards those. And I think the next step is like, well, do you actually achieve it? You want them to get better at math, or you want them to understand these biochemical threshold concepts. So you need to have some kind of way of assessing whether it's working, whether students are engaging one with your resource and whether it's an effective learning tool. So ideally, you're going to collect information about that and then feed that back into a modified version of the resource. So we've called this the sort of the virtuous loop that we want to create. So as we roll through iterations of it, it should get better and get more refined. And as we get feedback on it, it should improve. Well, there's a challenge to that. There's something else we spoke about as well in the case study. It's like the incentive structure around writing open education resources. Now, I think things are a lot better than what they were just even a few years ago. I think there's a greater understanding in higher education about open education. But it's still probably considered a non-traditional way of publishing. And so a lot of academics are going to be judged on the number of peer-reviewed articles that they've published and the impact factor of the journals that they're publishing and the number of citations that they've got and this kind of thing. Look, I'm seeing a shift in education to know that this may not be a great model for assessing effectiveness of, say, a teaching-focused academic or the educational output of an academic. So I think people are much more open to these open education resources, but also even in traditional publishing. Like maybe some of the metrics we're using aren't the best. Like I might read an education paper and adopt the practices. It might be even telling me about a great new way of doing something in the laboratory for teaching students. I might adopt it, but I might not cite it. Yeah, a lot of people will read it. So people are now starting to look at, well, there's the number of downloads, the number of views of the article, a better metric for an education paper. So there's a little bit of a change into how we're assessing educational output. I think open education is becoming a little bit more well known. But I still think it's still considered a bit non-traditional, and there might have to be some work done to convince, people who on promotions committees and
The powers that be.
who design the promotions matrices and things like that to sort of incorporate these into the incentive structure. But then, if we think about traditional publishing, if I publish a paper, that's it. Normally, I might follow it up with another research paper, for instance, but that artifact is done and it's out there for good or ill. But we do have the opportunity with open education resources to create that virtuous loop and to change them or to adopt someone else's open educational textbook for your circumstance or whatever. We've got that flexibility and that's its real strength. But how do you incorporate that work into your incentive structure? I can say, well, I've written this textbook and that's great. And a lot of people will go, well done. There's this digital object information that we can, that's there and we can, that's an artifact that's been created. But is it just as equally valid for me to adopt someone else's book and adapt it to our course? Do I get credit for going back and producing a new edition of the open education resource? I think there's a lot of work to go in sort of working out, well, how does that fit into an incentive structure? How do we motivate people to do this kind of work, which I think is really important. And I think we have to recognize it. So it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge and it's more about the incentivization of that work. So hopefully things will move in that direction because I think that's when they'll become much more effective and powerful tools.
Absolutely. And you also raise a really good point about in academic promotion, it's creation that is looked at, not necessarily adoption. And obviously we want to encourage lots of creation of OER, and so we want that to be recognised in promotion activities, but we also want people to adopt the OER that have been created and not just have everyone speak to the void, but have, the void speak back. So there's lots of work there.
I'm optimistic about it, and I'm seeing some change, I think. And, a colleague of mine has received a grant for adapting an open education textbook, from her institute. So I think there's a bit of recognition that it's important work, and it is work. It's not necessarily, straightforward to do that, to make it effective for your particular circumstance. And, that work has to be recognised.
On creation, I wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of students as co-creators and peer learning. I think that's a new addition to one of your projects. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so one of the things we've done in our first year biology course was we used to have an academic essay that the students would write. When you're dealing with sort of about 800 students, like every single thing you do is like planning the invasion of D-Day, right? So if you have to, get them to write an essay and then work out how to mark it and moderate it, it's complex and it gets expensive really quickly. And I got under there was a little bit of criticism, like, well, they have to write this academic essay. No one has to write an academic essay in their job. Like, why are we doing this? Yeah, the hierarchy wants something a little bit cheaper and easier to run. I understand that fully, but for me, writing was one of the good ways to teach people how to think, right? Like, to write, you have to have multiple ideas in your head at the same time. So I don't know how to do it with the advent of AI, right? It's just very, very hard to fairly mark this kind of work. So we've switched to students doing an oral presentation. And this is another challenge of the AI. Like, we have to make things a lot harder. The students to kind of collaboratively work with the AI, they have to work in this space where they can add something that the AI can't do. Plus, by making them do an oral presentation, we can kind of assess their knowledge, how much they've contributed, as opposed to just using these online tools. I'm disappointed that we can't do this with writing so easily. I haven't found a good solution for this at the moment. And I really hope that writing doesn't get lost as a skill, right? I used to put a lot of effort into teaching it. But we've switched to this, and part of going to quite a difficult oral presentation for our students, and we don't want them just reading an AI generated text, right? So we make them present without the use of any kind of palm cards and things like that. Like, there's a really high expectation. It's quite a difficult task. So we need to scaffold that. So this is where we thought, okay, like with the open education resource and this idea of a virtuous loop, right? Like, we can bring in the students. So the first time we ran this assessment, we identified the best students who really did a good job of it. And we brought them in and we recorded their presentations. It means that we have to have completely new topics for the next year, but the trade-off is we had some really good examples of students that were presenting their work. We could illustrate to new students coming in, well, this is the kind of thing that we were expecting you to be able to do. Okay, so a concrete example. And we think it's really effective when that comes from people their own age or people who are in similar circumstances. And it's great to be able to point out as well, it's like, well, this student came in with no prior biology. Now they're talking about this like really complex idea in biochemistry, and they've only been doing it for sort of 10 weeks. And here they are presenting it. And I think that's a really good motivator for the students, but it's also, we're modeling that kind of behavior. So we've brought in the students as co-creators, we've embedded their work in the open education resource. We've linked it to the sorts of threshold concepts that we're covering. And in fact, we base the topics on the threshold concepts themselves, extending them a little bit. So I'm pretty happy with that, actually, because I think it's a good example of where you can create that kind of virtuous loop that, we created this thing using the open education resource, but we can use it to get better student output. So I think it's worked quite well. It certainly diminished a lot of the anxiety students had around that assessment.
Which was your key goal from the very start.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, if you can overcome the anxiety and get them to do this, but also, like, particularly at first year, I want the students to forget that they were high school students and think of themselves as university students. But then I want them to forget that they're university students and think of themselves as young professionals with something to offer, right? And that's like a subtle shift in mindset. So it means that they, like, hopefully, like, they'll go, okay, well, if I'm going to be, working in this area at one point, I'm probably going to need to be able to communicate. So this assessment's like, a good opportunity for me to kind of develop some skills and get some feedback on how I present a complex idea to people who maybe haven't had any experience with it, which is something that you're going to have to do. So then it becomes not about the accreditation, but about the learning. And I'm happy if I can achieve that. That's what I've always done. So, and when I was teaching writing, it was very much like that as well. It was, like, well, don't think that you've got to write 1,000 words by Thursday. like, I need to communicate this idea to these people. And you're doing the same task in a way, but because you've got a purpose to it, which is sort of greater than just sort of getting this assignment in to get marks, you have a very different attitude towards it. So that subtle mind shift, yeah, creates a very different approach to how you do things.
I'm curious to hear more about the assessment design that you've done, but that's for a different conversation. Especially when you bring that aspect of students having a different purpose for doing the assessment. So it's not just submitting and completing an assessment, really having everlasting impact, which you talked about earlier in the episode, and where students contribute to an OER. They do the best to explain something to let's say, an audience who are maybe new to the topic or scratching the threshold concept, for example, that basic knowledge. And what I see in this, that you're actually changing the perspective of assessment genuinely. And this is what we work towards in renewable assessment, right? We change the incentive for students to complete an assessment for an extrinsic motive of achieving marks to more intrinsic motive to teach someone else something. So I really like that, but I guess it's another episode, I guess.
Could you give our listeners one practical takeaway that they could go away and implement today to begin work in this area?
Yeah, look, I think like, it's really important to have conversations, and I've kind of learnt that I speak about things even when they're sort of early ideas. I talk to as many people as I possibly can about as much as what I'm doing. And, if you've got the right kind of people around you that are genuinely, curious, I think, cultivate those relationships are really important, and talk with them. I think this is the most important thing. And talk outside your discipline area as well. Some of my best collaborations come with people who aren't biochemists. They have different perspectives and different ideas. I've always joked with Stephen that, he's helped write biochemistry textbooks, and he doesn't have the science background, but he's made actual real intellectual contributions to the work. I think don't underestimate how powerful those sorts of connections are.
And is there any upcoming work that our listeners could look out for? And where could they find you if they want to connect?
Yeah, probably LinkedIn is a good place to find me if you just put my name into LinkedIn and look me up. And I'll probably make announcements there of things that are coming out. I'm working on AI and assessment at the moment. We're trying to understand how that sort of impacted this topography of difficulty and complexity, and how we have to really redesign assessments. So this is something that we're working on at the moment. The other thing that I'm interested in, I've always been sort of interested in designing authentic assessments, and now they become even more important to kind of think about how we can design things that are valid, with the advent of AI. One assessment that I do with our third year biochemistry students is we do science fiction prototyping. Well, they use science fiction as a point of inspiration. This is serious stuff, so they've got to pick something which is related to biochemistry or molecular biology or cell biology, and then explain how that might become a reality. Right. So the work that they do is initially inspired by something which might be quite fantastical, or from whatever medium they like, whether it's movies or books or computer games or whatever. But then they explain, like, what would we need to do to make that happen? What are the barriers? If we could do it, what would be the scientific, societal, ethical implications of it? So, for instance, you might see a science fiction trope like putting humans to sleep for long space flights, right? So they can survive for an extended period of time. That's not that far-fetched. People are working on this kind of thing. And if you could put someone in suspended animation, you could certainly put organs to sleep, and for transplants, right, to keep them viable for longer. But also, like, humans are unusual in not being able to do this. Lots of organisms can go into suspended animation and survive on stored fuels, and sort of like, getting students to kind of think about that problem where they've got this science fiction kind of hook, I suppose, but they're really exploring real world ideas and looking at those implications of it. So the idea behind it is that a lot of work that you do at undergraduate's confirmatory, right? Like, you're just looking at things that we already know. We want them to start thinking about the hypothetical and really critically think about things and do that thought experiment, okay, which is what science fiction prototyping is about, sort of imagining, okay, what are the implications of this? And looking at sort of the logical consequences of it. So that's something that we're working on at the moment, to try to further develop that. I think this would be ripe for collaboration with other disciplines as well. I'd love to have someone who's involved in creative writing or something like that. So, we could have students collaborate between different disciplines on an idea like this. So if anyone's interested in anything like this, I'd love it if they reached out to me.
Brilliant. That's just the coolest assignment. I love that it's not only just fun and awesome, but it's genuinely valuing things the students value. They get to bring
Yeah.
part of themselves into this assignment and into this
Yeah.
course. It's very
Well,
cool.
that's really interesting as well, because we have run this as a group assignment, and it turns out that people's choice of inspiring fiction is really personal, and it doesn't work as a group assignment. It's something which is, I think it's a valid assessment in terms of AI, but it's a tricky one as well. But ultimately, like I hope that the science fiction is motivating for a lot of the students.
Oh, what a great discussion. I heard Julian speak at last year's Open Education Global Conference, but this conversation gave me a much deeper understanding of how open educational practices have truly transformed his teaching. As Stephen Chang, Julian's collaborator and the librarian on the project, often says, what's better than adopting open education practices is adopting it to solve real learning and teaching challenges. And that's exactly what Julian has done here. One important takeaway that I'd like to share with you is when Julian shared how embedding maths through teaching biology and biomedical sciences and that addressing students' anxiety directly actually helped them overcome fear and build confidence, reinforcing the power of open learning in contextualized learning. Another one is solving a real problem here. Julian explained really well how focusing on threshold concepts in biochemistry led to deeper and more integrated understanding for students, highlighting the importance of foundational knowledge here and the teaching presence in designing effective open educational resources. The last one I want to share is that the other aspect that emerged from embracing open education in his teaching was Julian's shift from traditional essays to oral presentations that actually allowed students to co-create learning material and also model peer learning here, which turned assessment into more of an opportunity for students for a deeper engagement in the learning environment.
Mm. I also love Julian's emphasis on speaking about ideas when they're in the early stages, a kind of collaborative attitude that values the thoughts and experience of others, even at that most formative stage of idea creation, is very emergent strategy vibes. That's a concept in a book by Adrienne Marie Brown. I think this kind of approach is at the heart of all impactful open education work. As we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, you can find the link to Julian's Down on DOER case study in the show notes, as well as links to the other resources he mentioned. We hope you enjoyed listening in on our conversation with Julian. You'll soon find more episodes on our YouTube channel at Speaking of Open, as well as on Spotify and wherever you get your podcasts. Please give the episode and show a like or follow or comment. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're keen to see more of what we're up to, you can find me at Ash the Librarian on all the things, Blue Sky, Mastodon.au, and LinkedIn. And you can find Mace at Mace Fataya on LinkedIn. The music in this episode is called Tomorrow, which is by Mermaid Guitar and released under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike 3.0 license. You can find that brilliant track and more at mermaidguitar.bandcamp.com. That's it for now. We'll chat to you next time where Speaking of Open. I'm going to have to cut us off because we could talk forever.
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to do that assignment.
Yeah.